This morning, we're going to take on a bit of a challenging subject because we're going to look at what Jesus tells these folks about the subject of divorce. It's interesting to me that Jesus would even bring the subject up. I am surprised because I think we tend to think of this as a 20th or 21st century problem. That we have refined the practice of divorce to quantum levels. And yet it was interesting as I began to look, how many of you have heard this statistic that 50% of all marriages end in divorce? It's not true. It's not true. It's not worse. No, it's not worse. Actually, it's better. Given both Christian statistics or Christian studies and non-Christian studies, most of them say that the divorce rate is somewhere between 30 and 35%. So that's certainly better than what we expected. However, and I've heard this kicked around for quite a while, and I'm sure you have too, that the divorce rate in the church is as bad as the divorce rate outside the church. Again, not true. The divorce rate within the church is somewhere between 15 and 20%. And that's a conservative estimate. One pastor who had performed 143 marriage ceremonies tracked all of those couples for 25 years. And only 10% had fallen into divorce or had divorced and separated from one another, and we don't know what the reasons are for that. We are told that 53%, I want to read this statistic correctly here, 53% of very happy couples, okay, this is a study that was done to determine marital happiness within a marriage relationship. 53% of the people who were surveyed said that they were happy in their marriage because God was at the center of it. That God was the core of their marriage relationship, and they were attributing their happiness to the fact that they had put God at the very center of their relationship. Compare that to only 7% of people who are struggling in their marriage indicate that God was at the center. I have shared with couples that I've counseled in marriage, premarital counseling. There's only one thing that will hold you to your marriage vows. Only one thing, and that's God. Your commitment to live a life that honors Him is the only thing that will hold you in your marriage. How many of you have been married over 20 years? How many of you know that you've had plenty of reasons, if you chose to cut and run? Sure, we have. Oh, come on now. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Sherry's told me that. Honest, I'm not kidding. No, hey, I'm not kidding. I know you think I'm this wonderful teddy bear. I tell everybody, I know I'm high maintenance. Okay, I know that. We have the opportunity to do it, don't we? Okay, so what holds us? What holds us? Because your vows aren't made just to the person you're married to. See, that's why this whole issue of how we're treating marriage, this is totally aside, okay? I did not have this in my notes. But it's why what makes this whole issue of marriage that we're treating now, marriage has become about who do you love, okay? And that's become the baseline. Now, I'm not saying you marry somebody because you hate them. Okay, that's not a good start. But it isn't just about that you love them. There is a commitment. God is the one who's established the ground rules for marriage. And as we commit ourselves to one another, we are first and foremost committing ourselves to Him. That we are going to honor our commitment to this person that we are married to. And that we are going to be faithful in that commitment. Because ultimately, if I'm not faithful in my commitment to my spouse, I'm not faithful in my commitment to God. You know, it was really quiet last week, too. Last week you were nervous. I don't know why sex makes us nervous, but it does. So amazingly, Jesus takes on this subject of divorce with this group of followers. I was processing this and thinking, here's this random group of people that are following Jesus. I mean, he's got his disciples, and of course he's going to teach them. But then he's got this random group that are following him, and he launches into this discussion of divorce. And I'm thinking, it just didn't seem to make sense to me that he would do it, yet he did. And I'm not trying to judge what Jesus, the approach that Jesus took. It just was surprising. And part of the reason is that it appears that even in Jesus' day, divorce was a big deal. Not that it was important, but that it was a hot topic. That there were disputes about the issue of divorce even during Jesus' day. Not only does Jesus address it here, but he gets questioned by the Pharisees at other times. Matthew 19, Mark chapter 10, where he gives more elaboration on the subject of divorce. Those are the same incident. They're just told by the two separate gospel writers in their own way. This issue of divorce was on the minds of the people and the leaders. But perhaps in a larger sense, it has to do with the fact that marriage is the most fundamental of all of life's relationships. Now, if you're here this morning and you're not married, that doesn't exclude you. I'm going to say something that I think will be important to you in just a moment. But we have to understand that God gave us marriage because it's the building block of society. It is the core relationship. We get all worked up about small groups and how important small groups are. Family is the first small group. God put us in families so that the same kind of dynamics that take place in a small group Bible study. Anybody ever been in one of those? Okay, we have small group Bible studies. Why? So people can interact with one another, so they can learn and grow and be taught and have a voice in what's going on. Share your thoughts and your ideas and get feedback from others. That's the whole idea for family. That's what God has in mind. And so in the larger sense, it isn't just about this narrow subject of divorce. It's about the fact that God is trying to preserve healthy families and trying to undergird that and support it in every way possible. It's obviously a relationship of special nature to God in how he established it, how he took such great pains in pointing out to Adam, dude, you're alone and there's not anybody on the face of the earth that relates to you. So I'm going to make someone who is your counterpart, that I'm going to put in your life that is going to be a blessing to you like you've never known. And it's not a small thing for us to realize that when it came time for Adam to choose between Eve and God, who did Adam choose? Eve. Now that might have been about sex too. I don't know. But it was certain that was supposed to be funny. Yeah, thank you, Kim. Thank you so much, Kim. Yeah. Kim and I, yeah, okay. But it was about relationship. It was about them being connected. Think about that for a minute. That Adam was willing to choose her over God. It would make sense that if marriage could be compromised, that the impact of God's order would be damaging, or would be damaged, if not devastated. And so, first of all, we see the effort that's being made to distort and to disrupt marriage, whether it's by the subject of divorce or whether it's by other intrusions that have come in on marriage that we've talked about at length earlier this year. Let me just say this as an additional thought regarding marriage. And Jesus makes some interesting statements. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 19, would you? Jesus is having this discussion, and he's talking about the issue of divorce. And in the earlier verses of the chapter, and he's talking about how God made them male and female, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. And then Jesus tells them this about divorce, that if you divorce your wife, that you cause her to commit adultery, or you commit adultery if you marry someone that's been married before. And here's what the disciples said. Look at verse 10. They said, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. That's kind of funny to me, I think. They say, well, my goodness, if that's going to be the deal, then let's just not marry at all. And then here's what Jesus says, okay? And for all of you who may be here this morning who are not in a marriage relationship, I want you to listen to this very carefully. Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, people who were born without the ability to procreate. He said there are eunuchs who have been made that way by others, people who have been injured by others. And then he says this, and there are those who choose to live as a single person for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. And Jesus says there's not anything wrong with being single. There is no fault. There is no diminished capacity. There's nothing of a lesser position. He said, as a matter of fact, some people choose it. They choose it so that they, if you will, can be married to Jesus. Okay? So as we talk about the subject of marriage and divorce this morning, I don't want anyone who may be here single today to feel that my view or the view of this church or even the view of Scripture in the larger sense is saying that if you're not married, you've somehow blown it or missed out or whatever. God doesn't say that. God doesn't say that, and neither am I. So please don't interpret anything that we might say this morning as an indicator of that. As a matter of fact, Paul says to the Corinthian church, he said, if you can't control your sexual appetite, it's better for you to get married than for you to burn with passion. And then maybe do something stupid. Okay? So those that may choose to live a single life probably have more self-control and discipline than any of the rest of us. Okay? Okay. So let's move forward. The text that I want to share with you this morning is from chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. And Jesus introduces it this way. He says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And so the question comes to us this morning, how do we live in the kingdom? What's the kingdom mindset or the kingdom perspective on this issue of marriage and specifically the subject of divorce? Someone has jokingly said, we said when we were getting married it would be for better or for worse. We just didn't know it was going to get so much worse. Jesus addresses first the prevailing approach to divorce in his day. He said, you have heard it said, give a certificate of divorce. This addresses a dispute that probably gave rise to the controversy over divorce and motivating the questions that were addressed to Jesus on the discussion. There were essentially two schools of thought in Jesus' day on the subject of divorce. The first school of thought was the Shammai, a rabbinical school, and they taught that the only reason for divorce was on moral grounds. Someone had committed adultery or some other form of compromising of the relationship of marriage. The other school of thought was the Hillel. And the Hillel accepted that divorce was allowed for any cause. For any cause. To give you an idea of what could be any cause, a wife could be divorced for burning the food. Yeah, we need to talk. Or a wife could be divorced for oversalting the food. One rabbi allowed divorce if the husband merely saw a woman whose appearance pleased him more than his present wife. So when Jesus says for any cause, he means for any cause. It's outrageous. So a man could present a certificate of divorce to his wife, and she could be dismissed as his wife. The certificate would allow her to remarry, or, and usually if she remarried, it was with the stigma of being a divorced person. And so that husband always had a superior position to her. She was forever devalued in her culture. Or the certificate of divorce would release her to go live with a family member if that family member would open the home to them. Problem with that is she usually was treated as a slave. Little more than a slave in the family. So that wasn't much of an option. And the third option was because she was legitimately divorced, she could find work as a prostitute. She would always be a marked woman. And it would never change. And so Jesus steps into the middle of this, into the fray on divorce by declaring there were no justifiable reasons for divorce except adultery. There were no other justifiable reasons. And he was unequivocal in the matter. Matthew 19:9, Mark 10:11 and 12, Luke 16:18. He reiterates it. This is the only justifiable reason for divorce. The Pharisees then played what to them was their trump card. Anybody want to take a guess at what it is? They said, well, Moses said that it was okay. Now, you know how they felt about Moses, right? Everything rolls downhill from Moses. He was the epitome. And if Moses said it, it was to be done. It was law if Moses said it. Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Listen to Jesus' answer. It's up on the screen behind us. Somebody read it. Verse 8, he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. Because of your hardness of heart. Essentially, the Pharisees' contention was that Moses said we could, so why does Jesus say no? Moses knew the vulnerability of women even in his day. And there were careful guidelines that were given back in Deuteronomy about how divorce was to be pursued. But in a larger sense, Moses knew how vulnerable the wife was. If a husband could divorce his wife because she oversalted the food, do you think anyone would say anything to him if he struck her? Do you think anyone would say anything to her if he shunned her? There's one account in Scripture where it says that a king became, I think it was King Vashti in Esther, that the king became unhappy with the queen and he forbid her from ever coming into his presence again. And that wasn't just the kingly power, that was the power in marriage. That was the power in marriage. Moses understood that. Moses understood that a wife could very easily have been physically abused, even to the point of death. And it was because of the potential for meanness from the husband. It was because of that potential, and in a larger sense, in today's world, in a metaphorical sense, of the meanness of either one of the spouses. It was because of the meanness factor Moses allowed them to give a certificate of divorce. Basically what Moses was saying is this: rather than have you be dead, I will at least allow you to be living somewhere else so that your relationship with this man who hates you will not be allowed to continue, and you can at least continue to live. That's essentially the idea behind it. We see this in marriages today. The hardness of heart factor. It wreaks great havoc in both men and women. The stupid husband, the dingy wife, neither of whom can do anything right. Ever been in those conversations? With family members or with friends who think of their spouse in that kind of way? The mistake that one spouse made that can never be fully forgiven. The hurt that was inflicted that can never be repaid. You can never do enough to pay back for what was done. And forever, the hardness of heart rules in that relationship. The anger and contempt that escalates into hatred and violence, and sometimes even death, because of the hardness of our hearts. And here's the thing, folks, we can all get there. We can all get there. Makes no difference who we are. Makes no difference where you stand right now spiritually. If we allow things to begin to penetrate, things that happen in our relationship, to begin to penetrate our hearts and begin to make us look at our spouse in a different way, we can develop the same kind of hardness of heart. I don't care how long you've been married. It's possible. This, according to Jesus, was a greater problem than adultery in marriage. The hardness of heart was a greater problem than adultery. How many of you know somebody whose marriage was impacted by adultery and they continue to be married today? People recover from adultery. Marriages can come back from adultery. No one can come back from a hard heart that is unrelenting in its unwillingness to forgive and be reconciled. No one can do that. No one. The entire story of Hosea, the prophet, the first time I read it, I thought, he can't be telling him to do that. But God tells Hosea to go marry a prostitute. And he says, not only do I want you to marry a prostitute, I want you to have children by her. And I'm thinking, God, what do I say to my teenagers in high school class? But his whole point was to teach them an object lesson. Now, hear me carefully here. God was saying to Israel, I have been a faithful husband to you, but you have been unfaithful to me. But I am still wanting to reconnect with you. I am reaching out to you to be reconciled to you, to be restored to you. But who and how does one overcome a hard-hearted spouse? And this is where we get to the kingdom element in this message. Because you see, the Pharisees sought to deal with it by divorce. The law said, if you give a certificate of divorce, you're good. There was no accountability for how you treated the spouse while you were married. There was no accountability for your attitude in the relationship. It's just give them a certificate of divorce, wash your hands, and be done, and go on to the next person. They thought that was the legal way to go about it. They decided to reject their spouse for whatever reason. They hardened their heart and they sought a divorce. And by giving a certificate of divorce, they had done not only the right thing and the legal thing, but in their culture, the righteous thing. Think about that. The righteous thing. Because they had followed the law. They had done what they understood the law to say. But Jesus said, that's not good enough. There is a righteousness that is beyond that. There is a righteousness that goes beyond the legalistic approach that he wants to point out. And what Jesus says is that it's better, that the better answer is to deal with our hard hearts and find ways to address the hurts and the bumps in marriage. If you've been married any time at all, like about a month, you know that there are hurts and there are bumps in marriage. Okay? And there are things that if you and I choose to be offended by them, it will kill your marriage. It will kill it. And you will lose the vitality and the love. The enduring nature of marriage is secured when we remain tender-hearted toward one another. That is what makes marriage enduring. When I meet with couples to counsel with them for premarital counseling, one thing that I tell them every session that we have, stay on the same team. Stay on the same team. The more you begin to think of an us and them mentality, you are setting yourself up for a hard heart that's ultimately going to see its only recourse in marriage as dissolving the marriage and going on somewhere else. Ladies and gentlemen, don't entertain those complaints from your friends who bring to you all of their dirty laundry about their spouse. Don't do it. That person that comes to you at the office and says, I'm really having trouble with my marriage. And whether you're male or female, I mean, if you're male and it's a lady talking to you, break the door down. Get out of that room. Okay? Because you're going to be the next conquest. Because she's looking for somebody who's going to say all the right things. And if you say, boy, you're right, he is a jerk, that guy, you're saying all the right things. And she is going to dog your trail. And then you're going to come to me and you're going to want to know, how can I get out of this mess that I'm in? Or somebody else. Okay? Listen. But then say to them, oh, but you know what? Your spouse loves you. And affirm that spouse. And say, you know what? You've made a commitment here. I will walk with you guys through it, but we're not going to talk about your spouse. And I'm not going to be the place where you come to bash on your spouse. Because if you let them once, they'll come back again and again and again and again, and you will be the one that they find as their partner in their anger against their spouse. Guard your heart. Guard your heart. In-laws can say unkind things about your spouse. And if there is any little struggle that's going on in your relationship, and an in-law says, boy, you know, I've seen this, and you say, well, yeah, well, let me tell you that, you've already started to build a wall between you and your spouse. Stay on the same team. Is your spouse perfect? Really? We all know our spouses are not perfect, right? Now, you want to know the other side of that argument? Neither are you. Neither are you. If I want to get down on one knee and I want to look you in the eye, and I want to tell you with tears in my eyes that it's way too easy for your heart to become hard. Guys, we say some of the most stupid, inane things to our wives. There's a series of commercials on the radio now, and it's a jeweler from the Bay Area, and he's calling guys randomly, and he's asking them on the air, not on the air, it's set up, it's a commercial. But it's like he's on the air. And he's setting these guys up, and he says, I want to know what you're getting your wife for Christmas. Well, what the guy doesn't know is that the wife is on another line listening in. Okay? And so these guys say, oh, man, I'm getting my wife a vacuum cleaner. and the wife says, a vacuum cleaner? I don't want a vacuum. She said, give me something pretty. You know, and of course, the jeweler has something pretty to sell, right? Guys, we can do that. We can do that. Ladies, we can nurse a wound. We can nurse a wound. And we can make it our lives. Okay? Be careful. Guard your heart. Guard your heart. Because Satan is looking for an opportunity to get an advantage of you. If he's looking at an opportunity to get an advantage of you over the people that you have relationships with, just friends, what do you think he's looking for to get between you and your spouse? As I was studying for this, one writer talked about the cycles of life that can get interrupted. And that if they get interrupted, we never get back to the same place. And he talks about the cycle that gets interrupted if a child doesn't bond with its mother very soon after it's born. That there's an impact that has on the child. We had a young boy that was in our church in Oakdale whose mother had left him alone in the crib, I forget how many months. Months. And the young man just, he was, socially, it had such a deep impact on him. He's made wonderful strides, but it just had such a deep impact. And the one commentator said the same thing is true with divorce. There is a bonding that takes place between a husband and wife. Two become one. Remember, two become one. It isn't just about blending checkbooks. It's about blending everything that you are. Everything that you are. And when that gets torn apart, it is devastating. It is devastating. Okay, I want to finish this morning by one last thing. So here comes the obvious question. So are there times when divorce is allowable? Yes. Yes, there are. Divorce is not the unpardonable sin. We have made it that way. We have treated it as though it were. But divorce is not the unpardonable sin. And so, yes, there are times when divorce is allowable. It should be limited, and it should be reserved for certain circumstances. For instance, stories told of a woman who married a man, and he married her to cover his homosexual lifestyle. Because the marriage had been consummated, her church kept telling her that she could not divorce him. This man would bring home his sex partners, would have sex all over the house, wherever he chose, in front of whom he chose. Now, you tell me, does it meet the intent of Scripture? And yet, it has been our posture in some camps that divorce is never appropriate. I would submit to you that that's a time when divorce is appropriate. There are other reasons. Physical abusiveness. Ladies, if your husband lays a hand on you, get out of the house. Get out. Find a safe place. I'm not telling you to start divorce proceedings the next day. What I'm telling you is find a safe place. Find a place where you can be protected. Now, if there's a need to work through some things, because here's the thing, if God is willing to reconcile with us, don't we owe it? If it lies within our power to choose, don't we owe it to our spouse to try to reconcile? I would say so. I would say so. If there is a desire to do that, there may not be. So when physical abuse comes into the picture, there needs to be space. There needs to be distance. And especially if there are children that are involved, get them out of the home. Another reason for divorce would be abandonment. If your husband or wife abandons you and runs away from you, that would be an appropriate reason. Another appropriate reason, and Paul mentions this in 1 Corinthians 7, when your unbelieving spouse demands it of you. If your unbelieving spouse says, I don't want to be married to you anymore, that's an appropriate reason for divorce. And these are only examples, because there are some folks who find themselves caught. God did not give us marriage for it to be something for us to endure to the bitter end, hoping that we can somehow not be beaten to death or not be unhappy for all the rest of our lives. God did not give us marriage for that reason. The larger principle here to be applied is that of keeping our hearts open and keeping our hearts soft. There are some folks who find themselves put upon by a spouse who simply says, I don't want to be married to you anymore. And what do you do at that point? That's one of those areas where divorce becomes an acceptable thing. But again, more than anything else, what Jesus is saying to us is don't let it get to that place, if you can, if it's possible, and keep your heart soft. Talk. Try to interact with one another. Try to resolve whatever it is. If you did something dumb, try to make amends for it. And if somebody did something dumb to you and you just almost can't get over it, think about when you may have done that to someone else and they forgave you. So the point is, don't let your heart become calloused and don't let it become hard.